So the hour of 9 o'clock having arrived, I'm going to open this meeting of the Joint Legislative Performance Audit Oversight Committee. And because it is the Senate's turn to preside, and because I am apparently the longest serving continuous member on the committee, I have been asked if I will open the meeting, and the first order of business that we have is to elect a chair from the Senate who will serve for the next 2 years. So with that, I'm going to throw open nominations from the floor.
I'll nominate Senator Rosenwald.
Are there any further nominations? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion that the nominations be closed and we cast one ballot. Is there a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Congratulations, Senator Rosenwald.
This is my first time on this committee, so it will be a learning process, but I think we have an agenda, and I see that our first order of business is acceptance of the November 10th meeting minutes. Lots of us were not on the committee then. However, because it's a new legislature, we can all vote on the minutes. We don't have to abstain. So has everybody had a chance to read the minutes?
I would move acceptance of the minutes, even though I wasn't actually at that last meeting. But
I'll second it. I
needs
was at that
must.
last meeting.
Okay. Is
Oh,
there
okay.
any correction needed to them or discussion? Well, then, all in favor of accepting the minutes as presented, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The minutes are adopted. Thank you. Discussion of performance auditing for new members.
Sure, we'll take it from here.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
And could you introduce yourself?
Sure. For the record, I'm Steve Smith, the Director of Audits for the LBA, and joining me here is Jay Henry. He's our Performance Audit Supervisor. So given that we have several new members, we thought we'd just take a few minutes and just, Jay's going to kind of do an orientation for you. He's already provided some handouts when we emailed the agenda, et cetera, some of the statutes that govern the committee and performance auditing. But Jay will kind of walk, just to give you kind of a general 30,000 foot level view of what we do when it comes to performance audit, but also in particular what the committee, some considerations the committee should take when they're evaluating and looking at topics. So
Great.
with that, Jay.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
As you may know, the LBA has two divisions, the budget division, the audit division. The budget division helps the legislature with the budget, and the audit division, we do performance audits and financial audits. This committee decides the topics that we're going to audit for performance audits. Audits evaluate past performances and provide information recommendations to improve government operations for leaders of the agencies and the legislature. Audits help to provide transparency of government operations. The legislature has given the LBA authority to access all types of program information, including confidential information, when it's directly related to our audit topics. We are basically able to look under the hood of programs to see how things are running. While we become knowledgeable about these topics, we are not experts in the topics. We are our value comes in knowing how programs, any government program, should be run, and understanding the internal controls that agencies should have in place. Government auditing standards, which we follow, provides a framework for performing high-quality work with competency, integrity, objectivity, and independence. Government auditing standards require us to consider fraud in every audit and be aware of it and think about where is it likely to happen. And even though it may not be the focus of an audit, it's something we have to consider. Standards require that we review at least elements of a program's internal control system. This includes the control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. Internal control is a process affected by the agency's management that will provide a reasonable assurance that objectives of the entity will be achieved. Performance audits take time and resources. It's not like a reporter just simply asking questions. We have to follow the government auditing standards. We research the topics, the industry that the agency is in. We research relevant laws, rules, policies, procedures, and guidelines. We seek input from the agency officials, staff of the program, users or recipients of the program, and other stakeholders through interviews or surveys. We test the accuracy of program data when we need to. We conduct file reviews, and we also try to write useful reports for the auditee and for legislative oversight. There is nothing in statute that requires an agency takes any actions on our recommendations. However, there are executive orders that require the agencies report to Transparency New Hampshire updates on the audits that they've on the how they fulfilled our recommendations. Now, you have two things that are important for this agency to for this committee to do. And one is to determine if the topic is suitable for a performance audit. As prior members of the committee can tell you, they spend a lot of time looking at a topic and deciding, is this worthy of a performance audit, or is this just a research question that Senate research or House research could answer? If you have us do it, it can become very costly because of all the things we have to do around it. The other thing you have to do is to decide what the scope of the audit is going to be. Now, the scope of the audit defines the extent and boundaries of what the auditors are going to examine. The number of elements go into this, including the question that you ask, the type of performance audit that you want, when the legislature wants the information, the availability of audit resources, what time period will be audited, do we need to do any samples that are statistically valid? Do we have access to complete and accurate data? The size and complexity of the program, and the need to compare it to other states' programs around the country. The scope and the number of weaknesses we uncover determine the size of our reports and the time it takes to complete. The size can also affect the auditee's ability to deal with what we give them. Recently, we've had 3 audits that have been over 300 pages. One of them had 60 observations where we looked at the entire agency. On the other end, we've had audits that just looked at the medical cannabis ID card and why it was taking so long to be issued. That ended up being a 30-page report with 9 observations. Now, the cannabis report only took 1,000 hours. The Wetland Bureau took 11,000 hours. So the scope of the audit, is important to how much work we do and how much time and resources we put into it. So I'd just say keep that in mind, when you make your decisions. I think that's about it. I don't know if you have any other questions. Do you have the handouts?
Any questions?
Nope, you're good. Okay.
Do we all know each other in this room? Well, you do, and I do, but we do have new people, so let's introduce ourselves, starting with the senator from District 1.
Carrie Gendro from District 1. And District 1, I don't know if this would be helpful or not, but it encompasses 58 towns, about 2,500 square miles, and it's in northern New Hampshire. So.
Lucy Weber from the House. I represent currently Surrey and Walpole, but I have at various times represented 13 different Chester County towns. I serve on Health and Human Services in the House, if that's helpful.
Good morning, Becky Whitley. I represent Senate District 15, which includes Concord, Bow, and Hopkinton. I used to represent Henniker and Warner, but my district has changed a little bit. In the Senate, I serve on Health and Human Services and the Judiciary Committee.
Good morning, Howard Pearl. I'm Senate District 17, which is basically east of Concord from Nottingham to Northfield, covering 12 towns. I chair ED&A in the House, in the Senate, and also serve as Vice Chair on Energy and Natural Resources and Finance as well. It's good to see my fellow House members again. I haven't seen in a while. So I served 3 terms in the House prior to this. It's good to be back and see you all.
Great. Cindy Rosenwald from District 13 in the Senate. It's most of Nashua.
Representative Ken Weiler, I'm chairman of the House Finance Committee, been on that for many years. I'm from Rockingham County, District 13.
I'm Jerry Griffin. I represent Mount Vernon, Lineborough, and New Boston. I serve on Division 1 of Finance and on the full finance, and I'm an alternate on fiscal.
Representative Keith Erf, I serve Ware, Vice Chair of the Finance Committee, serving on Division 3, and also a member of the Fiscal Committee.
Senator Tim Lang, District 2, goes from exit 29, east side of 93, exit 29, all the way to the east side of 93 from exit 20. I am the chairman of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, the vice chair of JALCAR, and I serve on education as well.
Great, thank you. So any questions for Mr. Henry or Mr. Smith? I have a couple. One, so you told us it can range from 1,000 hours to 11,000 hours. How many performance audits can you do a year? Or do you do a year?
It really depends on the size of those audits. We have, right now, I think we have 3 teams, 3 audit teams that are working. We have a new hire coming on in, I think, June. So we've had trouble hiring. It's been a very slow process, taking many, many months. That affects how many people are on the jobs. We like to have at least 1 in charge auditor and 2 staff. We've been doing some audits with just 2 people. We're going to be starting 1 audit right now with just 1 person who's going to end up having using a financial auditor for a few months as a staff. So, we're able to share some resources between the financial and performance side. And occasionally we also help the budget side during the budget process. I don't think we did it this year, but in past years, they've taken some of our people during the budget. Yeah. Because that's where it's really needed there.
So about how many have
I
you been
think
doing a
this
year?
past year, did we do 2 or 3? It's funny because we had 2 giant reports that came out, two of those 300 page reports that came out on the same day. And so we had a very slow year the year before, and then we ended up with 2 of those plus another one. So again, it's the size of the reports. If we're lucky, a fast report is 6 months, one of those, that 1,000-hour, unless if we put everyone on the audit,
Right.
it would come out a lot faster.
You can't do anything else.
Yeah, so it's a balancing act of what resources we have and what audits we have to do.
So I guess we'll have to keep that in mind. Can we request financial audits or just performance audits?
The committee's responsibility is just performance audits. I mean, certainly, either through Mike Kane or myself, if we determine where we go on the financial side, but certainly where we take input, if there are areas of concern, things of that nature, we can factor that into our rotation. We try to, depending upon the findings that we have, I'm speaking to the financial side now, we have a lot of material weaknesses, significant deficiencies that we uncover in one audit, then chances are within 5 years, we like to go back to follow up with those. However, if there weren't a lot of significant issues, then we may not go back for 10 years. So, and there are some we do every year to support the state financial audit. And we also have staff that support the single audit as well. So there's a lot of, our busy season is August through December.
Okay.
Because a lot of the staff is supporting to keep professional accounting fees low, as well as give our staff the experience of working with a national office and things. But like the Liquor Commission, the Lottery Commission, we have been doing those every
Right.
year. So,
Okay, so only performance audits. And finally, for people who are not on fiscal, could you explain what happens when a recommended performance audit is presented to the fiscal committee?
sure, when this committee, let me go back to the beginning, when this committee charges us with a topic, they would like us to look at, like the first one, weatherization. We will draft a letter for the chair to sign, and that will go to fiscal. Fiscal ultimately has to approve the topic. And once fiscal approves the topic, then it officially goes into our queue. And then we begin the process of scoping it out based on our understanding of what the committee has charged us with. And then we will come back to you with a scope statement, which we have one today for you to approve, which kind of outlines what we plan to do. We want to make sure that that's in line with what the committee wanted us to do. And that begins the audit. And typically, other than a quick status, if we have a meeting, we will provide that. But once the audit is complete, and we will present it to the fiscal committee, and there will be agency representatives or auditee representatives there to respond to questions or respond to the audit. So once all of our work is non-public, it's confidential until such time as that the fiscal committee accepts and approves the report for release to the public. So
And-
up until that time, it's closely held, non-public
And-
information.
In order for the fiscal committee to not approve a performance audit, it has to be a unanimous vote
I believe so,
of
yes.
the
Yes.
fiscal committee.
Yeah.
So
So
there are 10 members on fiscal. If one of them or even 9 of them don't want to do an audit, it still gets done because it would have to be all 10 members of fiscal saying no. Rep. Weber?
And just to make it clear, we don't see it till after fiscal has accepted it too.
Right.
We don't get first grabbies.
No, Representative Weiler has this wonderful statement about, it's like round up the usual suspects. It's,
Yep.
you know it by heart. What is it?
I move that we accept the report, place it on file, and release it in the usual manner.
There you go.
Senator Rosenwald, I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm curious about how, is there an opportunity for the public to have input about requesting certain audits? Do you take those requests and then bring them to us, or is that's just something that the public knows to bring to us?
If we are contacted directly, then we will, and we believe it's a performance audit type of a topic, then we will forward that to the committee for your consideration. But certainly, we prefer that in some cases amongst the legislature that you go through this committee, through your peers. So it's a combination of both, but we very rarely get someone contacting us directly. But most of our topics, I believe, come from, the members of the legislature.
But we probably hear from constituents.
Yeah, occasionally we'll get a member that will contact us directly, a House member or a Senate member, and we'll forward them to this committee. And in fact, most of our topics will come from you, and you may hear it from, people in your voters and your people in your districts or other members. We also present audits when asked to at policy committees. So we've done that in the past.
Yes.
And I would just add that in the House, at least, we in the past, I haven't seen so many recently, but in the past, we used to get several bills every year requesting performance audits. And when they came to a committee on which I sat, I always used to say, gee, we got this other committee. You could go there and it could be put
Faster.
in line next time we meet rather than waiting to pass a statute. And it just makes more sense because this is the place where people balance out the priorities for, you may have one very good idea, but there may be 2 or 3 more exigent ones in front of us. I'm remembering at one point where we had a very emergency audit of the veterans home.
Oh, yes. I remember.
Because there were a number of concerns raised from a number of different directions, and we felt that that suddenly should leap ahead of many of the things that were sitting before it.
Yeah, I mean, this committee gets to decide, or you can tell us which audits you want first. And you can also, you'll notice some tabled audits topics.
Yes.
You can look at those again. You can decide if you want to keep them tabled, put them in or act on them and go forward, or take them off the table and suspend them, or not suspend, but basically delete them from the table.
How often does this committee meet in a year?
I'm just say about 5 times. It's when we need you, really, or when you want.
That's great.
Yeah, or you have topics and
Okay.
you want
But
to
it's
act.
not monthly.
No.
Nice. Okay.
It's at the call of the chair.
Okay.
But usually we will reach out when we
And
need
say
the
we're ready
committee.
for a meeting.
But I'd say the last few years, maybe 3-4 times a
Great.
year.
Okay, any other questions about the process, Senator Pearl?
Good morning, thank you. So I see you have 4 that are tabled for audit topics. Do you currently have any audits that you're working on right now?
That will be the next section, the status of
See,
ongoing audits.
See, it was a good move to go right in.
Segue. Any other questions about process? All right, so please tell us about the ones that you're working on.
Sure. So the weatherization systems program, we've completed that, and that was presented to fiscal last month. You all should have received copies, as well as a link to the electronic version of that. The next one we're actively working on is the mental health workforce requirements. We're wrapping up our field work on that, and we're about to begin observation and report drafting. One thing to keep in mind is that this particular audit encompasses 5 individual boards, and they only meet once a month. So as we go through the summer, our goal is to get a draft report to all the boards by June, but it's going to take at least a couple of months for them to process it, act on it, respond, things of that nature. So I think we're looking at maybe at the earliest a fiscal presentation in September for this particular audit.
Okay.
The next one, special education dispute resolution process. We've completed field work on that. We're now actively in report and observation writing. We hope to have a draft of that to the department in late June, July timeframe. The next one is the state oversight of special education. In a few minutes, you will consider the scope statement on that one. So that is where we are with that. And the next one, Commission on Human Rights, we just began that. We're actually in communication with the director there to try to schedule an interest meeting. So we're just beginning with that one. And the other topic, just to make the committee aware, and as Representative Weber mentioned, here's a situation where we have a performance audit that was dictated in statute. So HB 1135 related to the Education Freedom Account. That doesn't become effective until October 1st, 2023. So basically the statute wants a performance audit done, but not sometime after October 1st, 2023. So that's in our queue, but not until later. So just to make the committee aware of that. So unless you have any questions on those, what I'd like to do is move to the scope statement. I know I'm going to ask the in-charge manager, Steve Grady, to come up and walk you through that.
Yes, Senator Lang
Sure, go
has a
ahead.
question.
Just real quick on that last item, HB 1135, does that mean you're not starting it until after October 1st?
That's
And
correct.
that's when you're going to start the,
That's correct.
we should get it sometime the following year.
Yes,
Thank you.
depending
will
upon,
We
again,
have the opportunity to decide where after of October 1st it fits into the schedule.
sure. Yeah, we're not gonna, we're gonna, it's there as a placeholder for our scheduling purposes, so the earliest that we're gonna begin it will be October.
Okay, but
If that's if that's the direction the commit, certainly the committee, again, it's in statute, so we have to act on it. But again, the committee can
but you can't
reprioritize or,
start it until October 1st.
correct, yes.
Okay, great. Representative Weber.
And would the corollary to that be that we could, at some time prior to October 1st, ask you to start it October 1st? Is that within our power, or do we have to wait until after October 1st to vote on it at all?
That's the effective date of of the bill is October 1st, 23.
Oh, I see. Okay,
So,
got it.
So it sounds like we probably
Yep.
would have to wait.
Yep, thank you.
Any other questions before we look at the scope? Okay,
Okay. So Steve Grady's the in-charge, and he'll come up and walk you through but also Commissioner Edelblut from the Department of Education is here, and I know that he would like to speak to the scope statement as well
Great.
after Steve walks.
Good morning. For the record, I am Steve Grady. I'm the Senior Performance Audit Manager for the LBA Audit Division. I am the in charge for Special Education Performance Audit. I can proceed through the details of the scope statement if you wish. If you have any questions, we can also take it up that way. It is your discretion. It should be in the bundle that you were provided. Shall I run through it quickly then? In May 2022, the Fiscal Committee approved a request from this body to conduct a performance audit of the efficiency and effectiveness of the Department of Education's oversight of the provision of special education. The topic was broad, and also it assumed that we would subdivide that topic, and we have done that. You heard earlier Steve Smith talking about the dispute resolution audit, which is ongoing now. This audit we're talking about now is the second audit from that request that this committee made. According to department data, there were nearly 31,000 special education students in New Hampshire as of October 2022. Over $91 million was budgeted for special education in state fiscal year 2022. Federal laws and regulations created a regulatory framework with broad objectives and numerous procedural requirements. The state special education program was required to comply with them. The state also had flexibility to determine how to comply with procedural requirements and achieve expected results. State laws and rules operationalized federal requirements and added to them. The state special education program was expected to prepare special education students for further education, employment, and independent living. Local agencies were to provide special education services to eligible students consistent with the state's framework. The Board of Education had a governance and standard-setting role. The board was to regularly review and make recommendations on all department programs. It was to advise the department on goals. The board was also to engage in rulemaking and evaluate the program. The State Advisory Committee on the Education of Students and Children with Disabilities was intended to advise the commissioner on special education issues and unmet needs. This committee was also to promote communications and cooperation, review funding, report annually on the status of special education, and assist with federal reporting. The department was responsible for providing general supervision of special education statewide. As the key control point for the state-federal relationship, the department functioned as a pass-through entity for federal grants. It made subgrants to local agencies. The department had to oversee federally funded operations, had to monitor the operations of local agencies, measure and report on program performance, develop and analyze information on issues and problems, evaluate local agencies' risk of noncompliance, and impose additional conditions upon risky local agencies when appropriate. Identify aberrant performance, help optimize local agency performance, and remediate noncompliance, and take enforcement action when necessary. Management was also responsible for designing integrated control systems to help ensure that it achieved expected results. Controls can help assure accountability and encompass the plans, methods, policies, and procedures used to fulfill the department's purpose and accomplish goals and objectives. The department monitored federally established metrics, which demonstrated the state inconsistently met performance goals, and these goals were primarily procedural compliance or near-term results oriented. Our proposed audit scope is how effective was the department's general supervision of the state's special education program in producing expected outcomes in state fiscal year 2022. We expect to do a lot of work with this program. We expect to review federal, state statutes, rules, policies, procedures, practices. We're going to review relevant audits, guidelines, and other material. We're going to observe board meetings and state advisory committee meetings. We're going to obtain perspectives from stakeholders. We're going to interview department staff. We will also examine department management controls and other relevant matters outside the audit period when they affect program operations during and after the audit period. We're going to examine board, state advisory committee, and other agencies' management controls when they affect the program. We will not, among other things, directly audit local agencies' compliance with state or federal special education requirements. We anticipate completing this audit and presenting the final report to the fiscal committee early in calendar year 2024. Do you have any questions for me at this point?
Thank you, Senator. I have a couple of questions, if that's okay. Yep. But the first one relates to the statement at the very beginning of the document. The state special education program was expected to prepare special education students for 1, further education, 2, employment, and 3, independent living. Is there any expectation that the audit will look into whether these goals are being achieved?
Yes.
Great. That's number one. And then an easy one, I don't know if this is relevant or not to your actual audit, but it'd be very helpful to know how much total spend, not right now, but in general, how much total spending is done by the local school districts, so the non-federal grants, but what schools have in their budgets basically as a sum across the state? Because I think it's substantial, if I'm not mistaken, way more than what the state is spending.
Yeah, I believe that the localities spend the vast majority of the dollars expended on the state special education program.
Thank you.
But it will be part of
Thank
what we
you,
look
Senator.
at.
Am I right in thinking this is going to be one of our larger audits?
Yes.
So this is the 11,000 hour type.
Yes.
Hopefully not 11,000, but it could. I mean,
How big a team do you?
Currently, there are 2 of us assigned full-time to the project, with a third expected to join us full-time probably in another 4 weeks or so. So we'll have a total of 3 working on it for the bulk of the audit.
Yes, Senator Whitney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, of course, special ed has a lot of federal law attached to it also, and likely a lot of sort of federal overview and supervision. So I'm wondering, to the extent that you all will review sort of the requirements in federal law for the Department of Education, and perhaps even look at any reviews that the federal Department of Education has conducted or not conducted.
We will.
More questions? Senator Burrow?
So I'm just doing some quick math in my head here. If this is a 10,000 hour audit, you only have 3 people on it. You're like 3 years before this is done? Am I doing my math correctly?
It probably will not be 10,000 hours, but the estimates do have us taking it through the first quarter of calendar year 2024 at this point.
Okay, thank you.
And
Any-
I'll just add, I mean, sometimes the resources we have available affects how deep we can go on any topic. And that's sort of a normal part of when we do audits. I mean, if you have a big team, you can do a lot of work, and we can dig down really deep. Other times, we have to also think about, if you spend a year on an audit, that's a long time. And sometimes you don't need to go down to the, looking for the penny. It's the bigger issues we find early on, and it's really documenting, the problems there. So it's a balancing act of, how much time we spend on every audit. I mean, if you let auditors go, we could spend a lot of time on every audit.
How many people do you have in the audit division?
For performance audits, we have 10.
So it's not huge.
Not huge, and you got 3 audits, so you can do, you see why, if we're lucky, we get 3 people on an audit. Sometimes we pull in someone just for a short time, like someone's free for a month or 2. And if the audit, there may be one part of the audit that they can do. I think we're even doing that right now with a financial auditor. Oh, no, you're not,
No,
you're
yeah, I
not
did.
taking the financial.
As I recall, having looked at a lot of audits over the years, most of the observations don't require legislative action to fix them.
You're correct. Yeah, some of them will suggest the legislature may wish to consider legislative act, or will tell the agency, you could, do what the law says or change the law. I mean, that's, we're compliant, so we're going to say the law says this, you're not doing that. First easiest thing is to do it, but it also could be that there's something, it's an old law, it doesn't make sense. It's also a time for the agency to come forward to the legislature and say, hey, the auditors found this, and it's a costly requirement. We don't need to do this. There's a better way of doing that.
And we're presented with things that are really more urgent and things that are less urgent when we get the audit reports, the material weaknesses.
Yeah, when
and
you
the
have
significant deficiencies.
you have 40 observations, an agency cannot just do them all at once. They have to, we talk about strategic planning. We hope that they take these audits, they think about what can we do, what needs to be done right away. Usually it's, the law says to do things, you ought to be in compliance, and then you start worrying about being efficient, and hopefully you're effective. That's the important goal, making sure the program is doing what it's supposed to be doing, according and acting within the law.
Any other questions for the auditors? Because the commissioner is here. I'm sure he wants to speak to the proposed scope before we take any action. Thank you. Commissioner. Morning.
Good morning. For the record, Frank Gateblue, Commissioner of Education. So I chose to come and speak to this scope statement today because I want to make sure that we achieve the objective that we have set out relative to this particular audit. Some of you who were around last year remember Senator Reagan, who was a champion of this, working very hard to make sure that the state, and when I say the state, I mean all public entities involved, are doing their best to make sure that we're serving the needs of some of our most vulnerable populations in the state, AKA some of our students with disabilities. The scoping was driven largely by very concerned and active parents of students with disabilities who came in and expressed their concern that the system was not serving them well. As Senator Whitley has pointed out, there's a lot of rules, particularly federal rules around this. So there's, and was already mentioned here, this is the second audit in this particular area. Let me just talk about that first one, which is around the dispute resolution. I've expressed my concerns internally, but I hadn't expressed them to the committee relative to that scope. But when we scope these audits, we need to make sure we scope it to get to the underlying problem. And as an example, in the dispute resolution audit, we are working with a population of transactions. So our sampling of transactions that we're working with are those interactions between the school district generally and the family who is not satisfied with whatever is happening there, that ultimately rise to the level of reaching a dispute resolution. What is excluded in that process and is widely known in the education community and the special education community in particular is that a school district who generally is armed with some very capable lawyers and parents who are generally pro se arguing and advocating for their children, when the school district perceives that they're going to lose, right? They've done, something's happened and they won't be successful in some type of a legal type of a process, they settle. They result in a mediated settlement, gets sealed locally, never shows up at the department, doesn't show up on any of the sampling plans. And so a lot of the individuals who are coming to share their concerns with Senator Reagan and other legislators are subject to a process that would not even fall inside the scope of some of this audit activity that we do. Now I want to turn to the current audit. And again, here I have concerns that the scoping of this work may not get us to the answer that we're looking for, right? It will feel good. We'll do an audit. We'll look at all kinds of ins and outs, and we're happy to look at all of our procedures. But at the end of the day, we want to answer the relevant question. What's interesting is you raised a question about the scope of this audit. And again, the scope statement indicates that there's $90 million of funds that are spent on special education. Can I just tell you that that is a gross distortion in terms of how much is being spent by the state? We did ask the audit team to include a broader scope so that it had context. You know, when we talk about $90 million, most of those funds are pass-through that are incorporating IDEA funds as well as special education aid, right? There's about $7 million that is retained by the agency in terms of administration. That's $90 million. What that doesn't include is all of, as you pointed out, the local spending, which is over or close to $900 million, right? So we're going to audit a small portion of this. What it also doesn't include is the adequacy, the differentiated aid funds that go into special education. So I'm not sure that we've completely encapsulated the full scope of activity relative to this audit. And I think it's an urgent audit. I don't disagree, right? We've got families that the system is not serving well. And so by scoping the audit as it has been scoped, and we totally appreciate that the agency is, they're limited in what they can do. Like, well, if you're tasked to scope an audit, you scope one that you can take care of, right? But if you're only looking at a subset of the overall thing, are you really answering the question that was asked to begin with? And so I think as well, just like in the dispute resolution audit, in this work, there's a misperception that somehow the agency as a pass-through entity can somehow affect. I mean, we can have a little bit of influence, but can we affect what's happening on the ground for families and children in the state of New Hampshire in the school districts in terms of what they are experiencing, whether or not goals of individual education programs are being achieved, whether or not the school is focused on making sure that those children can be successful. Our enforcement activities sometimes feel like a paper tiger. I have to sign complaint letters that I get, and oftentimes it's just a procedural defect, right? Like, I mean, I can tell you actual examples. A student gets an IEP and they say that they are going to be receiving in that IEP. This is just one that came up in the last month. This student will have an extended learning opportunity in their IEP to get them some work-related experience. Well, you know what? The student has been the entire year and we haven't seen any action on that. And the response from the district is, well, the IEP doesn't specify when it has to happen. meaning it could happen on the last week of school, and somehow that's going to be okay, right? So, like we're sitting here, I'm wanting to say, like, that's not what the intent was. The intent was to get this child the experiences. But sometimes the rules and the regulations don't allow that type of lean in. In that particular case, that's a federal rule that we can't do anything about. But I guess I'm coming to you today, just make sure that I advocate for a scope of an audit that's going to answer the germane question of making sure that students with disabilities are getting the best possible services that they can. And those are the only comments that I had.
Questions, Rep. Weber?
I think it's partially a question and partially a comment, and I'm seeking to understand if I'm hearing you correctly, because much of what I was hearing you say, particularly in your introductory remarks, had to do with the cost of special education. And performance audits are not to do with the cost. And they're not even necessarily, as I understand it, and I'm glad to be corrected, to do with efficient use of funds, although I think that comes into it tangentially. It seems to me that what we have here is what we're looking at, as the scope statement stands now, is the interaction of your department's supervision with all these myriad plans and rules. And although I would love to think of a way of doing that more narrowly, I can't, and doesn't look like anybody else has either. But I guess I would want to just say, when you came to your conclusion, which is we want to know we're doing the best job, which is certainly the goal of all of us, I guess I'm not sure that's the goal of a performance audit, because my understanding is that actually they're intended to see whether you're doing the job you were told to do by statute, rule, and other regulatory things. And then the corollary to that is, does it make sense to do this way, and do we need to make changes? Would you agree with that, or have I gotten that wrong?
So I appreciate the comments, but I also agree that this is a performance audit and it's not a financial audit. But the finances dictate where much of that performance takes place. And so what I would say is that the way that we've scoped this audit, which carves out a substantive amount of the performance, right? So this audit doesn't include looking at how are these students being served in our school systems where the bulk of the service is being provided. Knock yourselves out. You can audit away over here at our 10%, and some of our processes influence the school, but the performance by and large takes place in that local LEA. And so even if there was just a both and, like, let's look at some of the school districts, let's reach outside of ourselves if that's where much of the performance is taking place, to see what those interactions look like, to see how those schools are supporting their students. Because I agree with you, it's a performance audit, and much of that performance takes place outside of the scope of the department. And so so I think we're in vehement agreement relative to that.
Representative Wyler.
No, I think it's very important that we do look at how the costs are done, because it's the only way you can really assess this. And, it's this 3.5 times the average cost per pupil, which is about $75,000. And then it's 20% for the local district and 80% for the state until we get to 10 times, or roughly 200,000, and then the state pays the rest of it. And I think those are very important things when you're looking at the management. One that has always disturbed me is when the local district says we've spent 70,000, and 3,000 of that is this fund, and perhaps another 20 or 30,000 was Medicaid. We've never been able, everybody hides behind HIPAA and doesn't give us the true cost of how much Medicaid fund the local district is taking credit for, that you don't know. You just get this, we've spent 70,000, give me more. And maybe they didn't spend 70,000 of local funds. Maybe they just spent half that. And so I think that's an important aspect that's part of this, in my mind, of looking at the scope of this statement, seeing how all the funds are divided. And I hope we can get more information on HIPAA, or not HIPAA, but Medicaid funds, because it's always avoided. Even if we just had it in total, like special ed includes 100 million of Medicaid funds, we ought to know that, because we're paying for that in another place. So I think that's an important part. Maybe it's more than they want to take on in the scope, but I think I would like to know it from an aspect of auditing. So where's the real money coming from? And it is, like you say, huge amounts, a lot more than this 90 million that we're reading here. So anyway, I'm hoping that can be included.
Questions, Senator Whitley.
Yeah, I'm just sort of thinking about scope and what is actually doable. And I think, what I'm hearing is your desire to sort of expand it to look at, what's happening at the LEA level. And I think, while that would be valuable information, that would be impossible to do, to look at every LEA. And so what I think that this committee needs to sort of focus on is the scope of, this audit is supposed to look at the Department of Education's efficiency or ability to conduct their monitoring enforcement of these requirements, right? We're looking at the department, are there the appropriate policies in place to adequately meet their monitoring and enforcement requirements? So I think that has to be sort of the focus here, because they are, there's very prescriptive requirements for monitoring and enforcement within federal law and state law. And I think that needs to remain the focus, because I think whether the, LEAs are appropriately spending money and how much sort of flows from that. So I think it's more appropriate to look within the department rather than going to the LEAs. And, if you're doing your job the way that it's required in federal law, I think the auditors will be able to see, whether that the LEAs are acting appropriately.
So if I just might respond, so I was not advocating that we audit all of the LEAs, but in auditing, we have an approach called sampling, right? So it is possible to sample LEAs and understand better what is happening in that sample of LEAs. That's, I guess, what I'm saying relative to the scope is that it really, I think you're missing something if you don't go beyond. It's a little bit like the dispute resolution. Like we've made a selection of transactions to audit, but we sampled out of 10% of the transactions rather than the whole pie of transactions. And we're going to reach a conclusion about a population of transactions when we've only looked at a subset. You're going to run into the same problem, I believe, here in terms of trying to reach conclusions about what's happening with where the bulk of the performance is taking place. You'll try to reach conclusions, and you will have only looked at a very narrow subset of what's actually happening.
May I?
Yes.
And what I am saying is that if, the department is doing its job in terms of fulfilling those requirements, that sampling wouldn't be necessary because it would already be in the review of what you are doing in your department. So I think that's already done.
Are there questions? Representative Burr.
Thank you, Senator. Do you have specific recommendations you could provide the committee in terms of how you would see extending the scope we have here?
So we're happy to work with the LBA in terms of trying to design a scope that includes a both and as opposed to a singular approach. Those were conversations that we did have with the LBA prior to this, and I'm happy to engage in those conversations with them.
So are you suggesting that we would sample X number of districts to see the interaction of the department and the local school district?
And relative to the performance in the local school district in terms of meeting, again, there's this body of, regulatory, schema that is, required to be complied with. And again, we have a role in that performance, and the LEA has a role in that performance, and is really a both and.
But we wouldn't be looking to do a performance audit of the LEAs because we can't.
Why can't we?
All we can really do is look at, did the department meet its regulation requirements in how it interacted with the LEAs?
Yeah.
And So I
And
think
I would-
that was the point Senator Whitley was trying to bring up,
Right.
that if you're meeting those requirements, then why would we sample?
And that's in fact what the fiscal committee approved, was to conduct a performance audit of the efficiency and effectiveness of the Department of Education's oversight of the provision of, so I think it would seem to me that if we would broaden the scope, we would have to go back to the fiscal committee because they were pretty prescriptive in their approval.
Any other questions, Rep. Weber?
I just have a comment that kind of meshes, I think, with Senator Whitley's, which is coming from small rural communities rather than large urban communities. I think in order to have any kind of representative sampling of how we're doing on the local level, we would need a lot more time and a lot more personnel than we have available to us before we could actually get a representative sampling of school districts. Because as we all know, the Manchester and Nashua districts are nothing like the Fall Mountain School District.
Representative Griffin?
Commissioner, how does your department address that issue now? Do you have people who actually go out and look at the local operations?
We do some monitoring for the various districts. It is somewhat of a paper tiger in terms of there's a lot of limitations on what we can say, what we can lean in on. And even we suffer from we have no access to these mediated settlements that take place in a district. So if there is an issue and a district decides to settle that locally, then that's out of our hands and we don't see any kind of an infraction. So even if I'm monitoring a district, I'm not going to see that. And so I myself may reach an incorrect conclusion in that process.
Wouldn't that be part of the dispute resolution?
That's if it gets
Audit?
to a dispute resolution.
Okay.
But that's the point is these are taking place, these are settled long before they get into that process. So again, we're looking at a subset of what's taking place and reaching a conclusion about the totality of it, which may be what was the parents who came to this committee and expressed their concerns, and to fiscal committee and expressed their concerns, are trying to say like, hey, over here, you're not hearing us, right? And so I think that the objective of this audit, in my recollection of sitting through those committee hearings, I think you were part of that, right? There was a lot of concern about, how these things are being handled in the field.
Representative Weiler?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think for Mr. Henry, Mr. Grady, to make a full-rounded report, have a few tables showing things like the formula, 3.5 times, 10 times, 80%, so on. And what I haven't seen in quite a while is the very numerous list of what an IEP is for. I mean, I remember seeing things like anxiety, which may or may not affect the real academic achievement. And they keep adding new things. And I've been a while since I've really seen a list. Do you have any idea how many there are? There could be 100.
I do. We have a very discrete list of diagnoses.
Yeah,
So.
but it's very extensive. It's just been so long since I've seen a complete list, and I think to have a rounded report, at least show the list, even though you don't have to go down and cover each one. But there's some of them that seem a little strange to even be included in an IEP.
But they are.
Thank you. And I appreciate you letting me come in and share my
Yeah.
concerns about the scope
No,
statement.
so I have a question. If the goals are to further education, employment, and independent living, those last two seem almost retrospective. Like you wouldn't really know until the end of someone's high school career.
Yeah.
Well, really all of them, whether they were furthering their education, whether they were employed or living independently, and those actions might take some transition and time. So I guess I'm curious, for the LBA, how would you measure those three goals.
Madam Chair, Steve Grady again.
Come on up,
So-
Steve.
The other way, but this will work. So in IEP planning, at the age of 14 years, IEP teams are supposed to plan students' transition. It is supposed to include whatever objectives that individual has in mind. So whether it's further education, employment, and then an underlying independent living. So starting at the age of 14, IEP should be moving a student towards those goals. And yes, they transition out of the program in any number of ways. Some may drop out, some may graduate, some may then go into subsequent education settings. They may go get a job afterwards. And hopefully are getting, moving towards independent living. There is a survey that the department does of post-program exiting students that measures both education and employment. In some respects, there are some methodological concerns with respect to that survey. It only gets to, I think we were told, maybe 2% of the population, and there are a number of mechanical problems with getting the survey to everybody that we would like to see get that survey. And it is done once, 1 year after they leave the program, and then never again. So systematically, it is something that is of a concern, but we do have procedural control concerns around that.
So your audit would look at how the survey was administered, how many people responded. Okay.
We expect to look at the life cycle of a student's engagement with the special education program. So we expect to pick that up somewhere around the age of 14, look at the transition, see what's monitored with respect to transition planning.
On the
and
state level.
At the state level, yep,
Okay.
because every jurisdiction, most jurisdictions report data to the state. If the state's collecting those data, we'll look at it. If the state's not collecting relevant data, we'll have something to say about it and suggest that they actually collect those types of data. So
Senator Whitley and then Pearl.
Madam Chair, I think it might benefit as we're talking about this scope, I think this committee would benefit from looking at the federal requirements of the SEA, the Department of Education, because IDA, which is the federal, special ed law, places pretty strict requirements or responsibilities for monitoring and enforcement of the local communities, places that with the Department of Education. And so I think it would help us understand what the DOE may already have in their possession in terms of monitoring LEAs if we saw those requirements. So that would be a suggestion of mine.
Is that something that you could provide us?
Yeah, I assume that would already be part of the scope of this audit.
Senator Pearl.
Thank you. Commissioner, I'm new to the board here, and I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding what you're asking. As I'm reading the audit scope is, how effective was the department's general supervision of the state's special education program in producing expected outcomes? And from what I'm understanding, you're saying is this is more of a partnership with you and the districts themselves in achieving those expected outcomes. And it seems that you're asking for a little bit more depth in the scope here to make sure that you're achieving those expected outcomes, and you don't feel that we have quite enough in here to really gauge that.
I worry that when we scope these audits, we scope them such that we're not actually answering the salient question, which is the customer that's being served. And so we have a sampling of convenience because this is what we can cover. My objective was today was none other than to come in and share with you my concerns about the scope, but assuming that the audit would be be going forward. As an example, relative to the scope statement, when we first got the scope statement relative to those goals, it said, to make sure that all these students had post-secondary, and we said, well, that's not really the goal for these kids. So we expanded it, working with the LBA to say, no, there's much broader goals for these students, right? So again, just, because initially that scope statement said to make sure that every student is prepared for post-secondary. Well, some of these kids are not going to do post-secondary, and that's not even the best pathway for them. So I want to make sure we don't have kind of a scope statement of convenience, because if that was your scope statement and they came back and said, well, only 8% of the kids went to post-secondary, well, that wasn't even the goal for these kids, right? So we have to make sure we get a scope statement that answers the question that the families of New Hampshire are asking. That's what I'm after.
Representative Wyler.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is a success in special ed and it's a note that I've seen through the years, there's far more special ed in elementary schools than there is in the later grades. And it's all due to not learning to read. And so once that student gets IEP for reading, and they really learn to read, which they maybe didn't learn in the first few grades, then suddenly they're a regular student. And it's a success of the program.
We
I
want
guess.
all our kids reading. Yes.
We wish they were all that easy.
Yeah.
Senator Lang.
Thank you, and I apologize for missing some of the meetings. So if this got asked, I apologize, I'm asking it again. So like Senator Pearl, I am concerned about that producing expected outcomes statement in line. Because it's, as I read this, it seems like it's related to the top part of the page. It talks about the department functioned as a pass-through entity for federal grants that made through sub-grants to local agencies. It had two, and it has about 8 or 10 bullet points there that are basically about the management of the federal grants, but doesn't talk about the individual student, right? It doesn't have the outcomes about the individual student. So I'm trying to understand, is this audit scope about the fact that you've managed the money properly, you've done the performance management right, you've done everything, but you can't get down to the bottom detailed data of the student and the outcomes of the student, which, so that word outcomes is, I guess, my question. What are we measuring here as we look at this? We're looking at how the agency has managed special education dollars, and did it make its way down, given the LEAs saying this is what we're doing, right? And you've audited that, because one of the things in here is monitor the operations of local agencies, and it's a test to see, are you in fact monitoring? But again, it doesn't get down to student outcomes. It's about the outcomes of the dollars and the management of the dollars and the management of getting it to the students.
Again, I worry, having sat through some of the meetings relative to the scoping of this audit and the conversations with Senator Reagan and the conversations with the families that were coming in, the goal was that we had families who didn't believe that their interests were being served by a bureaucracy. And so I don't want to go say like, well, the bureaucracy did everything it was responsible for if the students haven't been served. So
Representative Weber.
Well, I think the even larger sampling that we're ignoring in that question is all the families who aren't complaining and who feel that they have been well served. So there's that. I'm wondering, first of all, sometimes when we have these meetings, suddenly a number of audits have wrapped up and you're looking immediately for more work. My first question is it, am I correct in sensing that you have plenty of work to be going on with at this point?
With respect to this audit,
No, I mean with respect to the other audits that are going
I have to
on.
defer to somebody else, but I've been working on this particular subject since November of 2022 in order to prepare this
Right.
statement.
And so I'm gathering that your perspective is you'd like to proceed forward with all deliberate speed.
I would like to proceed forward with whatever's going to satisfy this committee's questions.
Okay.
If I need to do something different, I would be delighted to do that.
I was trying to figure out whether we have some time to think about all the new things that have been brought up, because this is a very different group of people than the ones who approved the statement. And while I don't want to slow anybody down, I don't want to rush it either. So I'm trying to figure out, in the context of what we can do today, whether what we really want to do is full speed ahead. And I'm actually relatively comfortable with that, but willing to be persuaded otherwise, because my perception is that what we were talking about was looking most specifically about how the department interacts with those it's supervising. And we were not planning, nor I think can we appropriately with the staff we have, unless we want to employ a lot of other auditors, make any kind of a comprehensive evaluation of how individual students' needs are being met and the percentage of students whose needs are being met. So I was comfortable with the scope as we approved it. I'm still comfortable, but if there are tweaks that the committee wants to suggest, I'm certainly willing to listen to them.
Senator Whitley.
Madam Chair, I'm also comfortable with the scope, and that's only because I know that federal law is very specific that they place the responsibility of monitoring and enforcement of our LEAs on the DOE. And so what I think the committee is interested in should be already available if the DOE is appropriately doing their monitoring as required by federal law. So that's why I think this scope is appropriate, because it should already be there.
Representative Burke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have a very different perception, having been with the committee when the prior chairman, who was the one that was requesting this, was speaking to it. And it much more closely matches what we're hearing from the commissioner, and that is, what are the results? Why was he getting all these complaints regarding special education, specifically from parents related to their children? I understand the issue of trying to get to all of the children would be a very big problem. But during the presentation that the LBA gave here, they specifically stated that these performance audits relate to past performance analysis and that users can be included in the analysis. So it certainly would seem reasonable to me, in fact, I would expect it, that they would be talking to the parents and the children. How have they proceed and how have the outcomes continued past, I don't know whether I say high school or whatever I say, but beyond this period of time we're talking about? What about the kids that are the folks that have been out for 5 years? Where are they in terms of this life cycle? And where are the parents or caregivers in, how are they seeing the process? And has it gotten better or worse or whatever? So I would very much like to see that, at least at some level, that we would hear more than just, I certainly want to know that the department is doing everything correct per federal law. But I sat on the finance committee in our town, and I was on the school board part of it. And the biggest black hole was special education. And I do believe that it would be helpful if we started to dig into it at the whole level, not just, are we obeying the federal law? Especially the federal law, you can obey the federal law, as it was sort of implied here, and still not get any good results out of the other end.
I just want, I appreciate that clarification. And thank you, Madam Chair. And what I was saying is that, I fully agree with you. And I think that information is very valuable. But I guess my point was, if the department was complying with federal requirements about monitoring, they should have already looked into those parents' complaints and looked into those budgets that didn't work. So I'm saying that the information should already be there if they're doing their work appropriately.
I guess where I'm struggling on the scope statement is with the 2 words, "in producing," because the department can only do its part. The local districts have to do their parts, and the federal government has to do its part. So for me, the words "in producing" is giving, I think, the department more power than it actually has. So I'm not sure those 2 words are right. Representative Weber.
I'm just reading what you're going to do with this, and it seems to me that a great deal of what I think I'm hearing Representative Irf say are included under the bullet points on page 3 of obtain perspective from stakeholders outside the department and observe board and SAC meetings. Do those not speak to sort of the end results, and also the work done, the incorporation of the work done by the committee to study special education dispute resolution options? Do those not help us get towards including in this the kinds of interactions that Representative Irf is talking about?
I believe they do. The State Advisory Committee was specifically created to advise the commissioner on special education. It is also specifically composed of parents. It is supposed to be a forum for airing concerns, that gap that the commissioner has referenced of things that don't manifest themselves in the department's radar. Those kinds of things should flow through the State Advisory Committee. If the State Advisory Committee is working correctly and providing the input that it needs to, then the department should be well informed as to the concerns that the program may be facing. If that committee's not working well, then we have a systemic defect, because that committee can contribute to not just one or two or a handful of students or local education's efficiency and effectiveness, but to the system's efficiency and effectiveness, affecting 175 local jurisdictions and 31,000 students. And that's the locus of control in this relationship that the federal government has with the state and the locals. Everything flows through the department. And to have $90 million budgeted at the state, and to suggest that $900 million is the real number we should be looking at, is a little bit misleading, because that $90 million or that $7.5 million that's budgeted for department operations controls the results of that $900 million. And that's why we've chosen to scope this audit the way it has, because it's going to have the broadest effect that it possibly can, because we cannot audit 175 localities. We have statutory prohibitions on the number of localities we can actually look at in any amount of time. Moreover, we cannot individually review 31,000 IEPs. We can't even take a sample of 31,000 IEPs and do that in any time that's practical. So to hopefully address some of your concerns, we have targeted this audit to focus at the key state control, and that is the department and its operation of the program.
But the
I just want
department
to point, it might be an
supervision
overstatement.
can't
Yeah.
produce those
Sure.
outcomes.
Under,
And that's where I'm
Good.
struggling on this.
well, and the department is
Those two
obligated,
words.
the department is obligated to take a look at the data that it gets back and produce empirical results from the data that it's collecting from the jurisdictions to identify successful and unsuccessful approaches. So if the department is doing that correctly, it should be identifying good approaches at transition planning for 14 through 22-year-olds. If it's not collecting data on that, then that's a gap in the control framework. If it's not overseeing that performance well, then that's another gap in the control framework. So that's why we're targeting at where we're targeting.
Senator Lang.
So again, I guess I'm okay with this going forward, just with the understanding that we're actually just auditing the department and not the educational outcomes, right? There's no educational component of this at all. Alls we're doing is whether or not the department's checked all the boxes the way it's supposed to check all the boxes. And my one concern would be that we tell the audit comes out and says, hey, they're doing their job, and we have parents screaming like, no, they're not. And it seems like a completely contrasting discussion when we're saying we're going to audit them, and the audit says they're doing their job, and we have parents. But I will say that, and I guess it's a matter of timing on whether or not you have the special education dispute resolution process audit that's due out in a few months, on whether this should be held until we know what that looks like, to see what the scope should look like. Because that addresses the parents' question right there, whereas this is just addressing the business question.
This scope addresses more than the business question. It is not a compliance audit. We do compliance auditing within the context of a performance audit, but we're looking for results. So we're going to be looking at the effectiveness of the department's compliance or non-compliance with the requirements that are imposed upon it. And if those do not produce the results that we are looking for from the program, which is articulated in state law, we're looking to ensure that students have an opportunity to get into subsequent education, to get into employment, and to achieve independent living. If they're not contributing to those results, that's the focus of the audit. Does the system the department has in place contribute to achieving those expected outcomes that the legislature has imposed upon it in RSA 186C?
It seems like that word contribute to is important, Senator Whitley.
Yeah, and I sort of feel like a broken record about this, but just to follow up on what you just said, the department is required to make sure that the LEAs are achieving those outcomes. And so that's what we're looking for. So I think it's Senator Lang, you're right, that it's both, are they meeting those requirements, but then to know if they meet those requirements, they have to look at the outcomes. So that was sort of my point. Is that correct?
It is, and one of the results that federal law and rule expects is improved results for students. And that is one of the things we're going to be looking at. Is there a mechanism in place to examine whether results improved over time or did not improve over time? If there's no system in place for that, then that's a systemic flaw in the department's control construct. And then we'll look at the data to see whether there's actual improvement demonstrated or not. And then we'll go from there to see what might be contributing to what we're seeing in the data.
So if you were to expand this scope, it would take longer.
It would definitely take longer. I was asked to calculate those numbers. At a minimum, it would take 4 extra months and another $250,000.
Okay. What is the committee's pleasure, Representative? Or
So just one other question there. Senator Whitley has made pretty clear that the federal laws, dictate all this, and I totally get that. Do you envision that in your audit, you might perceive weaknesses in what the federal law allows the state to do in terms of overseeing the localities? So we might become aware of the fact that there are areas there where the state is incapable of totally overseeing the localities?
If we found something like that, we would certainly have something to say. I will note that the federal regulatory construct gives the department a great deal of discretion in how it implements the program at the state level. So it's not a checklist per se that the state just picks up and runs with. The federal government places a significant amount of requirements upon the expenditures of funds and the like, but it does not specify how the department is going to frame the program, how it's going to achieve improved results for students, how it's going to ensure that the results that the state, because this is still fundamentally a state program, it is federally subsidized to some extent, but it is still fundamentally a state program. So the federal government delegates substantial amount of authority to the department to construct a program to effectively achieve those expected outcomes.
So can I just
Your
comment? I just
scope
want to,
statement,
can I,
get to that, yes, of course.
Where does enforcement come in that?
Enforcement comes at the back end. The department has an obligation to identify aberrant performance in the program and to address it through enforcement mechanisms if necessary. So those entities that are persistently non-compliant are subject to sanctions to include up to and including suspension of their grant.
so can I just clarify? I mean, because I think it's an overstatement to say that the department has significant amount of latitude to enforce this. I mean, I am regularly hemmed in by my own agency saying, you don't have authority to go there. Like all I can do is work within a procedural framework. And I use as an example, this recent example of, a poorly executed IEP, and a student, clearly everybody's intention was for a child to be able to get this experience this year, and the district not doing that. And I don't have the ability, I have no legal authority to come in and say, like, look, give the people the thing. What we do is we work with schools, with our relationships to try and help them to do the best thing for the child. But that would be an example of not having the authority. I would have been happy to put the kid in IEP today, but I didn't have that authority.
Could we give you that authority?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
And isn't that why we're thinking
Doing a
about proceeding
performance
with this performance audit?
Right.
Would you be
see
willing to
if
entertain
we
a
can
motion?
help. Well, are there more questions, or is the committee will to? Okay, I'm willing to entertain a motion.
I would move that we accept the scope statement as written, taking into account the explanations about all of the aspects that members of the committee have touched on that appear to me to be part of what the audit is going to look at.
And I'll second that.
Is there a discussion?
I'm good with that as long as the LBA is good with that they've been taking copious notes and they'll take that into consideration when they're actually doing the auditing work.
If you'd like me to respond, we will be. So fiscal descriptions, yes, we're going to take a look at trend data over time, or can we include such a table as to what are IEP suitable conditions for students? We can certainly include that kind of material in there. And if there are other specific concerns, we can address those as well. And yes, we'll go back through our notes and make sure we've got everything. But fundamentally, I just want to state that what we've discussed here today principally is what was in the scope. We intend to take a look at the results the department is facilitating through the state's system and see whether it achieves those expected results or not.
And given its limitations.
And we'll closely look at what the provisions of federal law and state law provide, as well as federal rules, state rules, and other authoritative guidance. And we will identify any gaps, and if there are opportunities for this body to suggest legislation or for legislation here to be suggested. We'll certainly identify those as well.
Senator Whitman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think it would be helpful, Mr. Grady, if you would share, I think it would, you know, make the committee perhaps more comfortable with the scope if you could forward us those federal requirements regarding monitor enforcement, because I think that's relevant to our conversation if you're able to send that along.
We can do that. It might take a little bit of time
Sure.
because we're just scoping now, right? We haven't commenced, I have an approved scope statement to commence field work with. And that is something that we would work through during field work, but it is certainly something that we could generate for this body as soon as we reasonably can. We can certainly prioritize that part of our planned work to occur sooner rather than later and get you those citations.
That would be great. Is there more discussion? Okay. So the motion is to approve the scope, and the audit committee has been taking notes on our discussion. And any other, all right, I think we can do a voice vote. If you're in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Okay, the scope is approved. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you, Commissioner. That was a good, wholesome discussion. Okay, what else do we need to talk about now? The tabled and suspended items.
Yep, just very quickly on item number 4 there in terms of the suspended or tabled topics. Just a little brief synopsis. The Bureau of Elderly and Adult Services, that was suspended in November 21 by this committee, largely because when we began the audit, we became aware of two legal proceedings, lawsuits that were going to be central to the audit topic. So as not to interfere with that or have that interfere with our audit, the committee recommended that we suspend that for
And those
whatever
suits
time.
are still
Yes,
ongoing.
yeah, and probably will be for a while is my guess. Public access and bodies of water, I think, as I recall, discussion amongst the committee, there was going to be some other legislative subcommittee that was going to be looking into some of that. So it was decided not to move forward with that at that point in time.
Was there? Does anybody
think-
know of?
Yeah.
Not
yeah,
my
so-
department,
Did I get that right? Yeah.
and Senator Pearl's not here, so.
What I think, if I remember correctly, with I think someone had asked you about public access to water. You brought it up as a topic that you received, and it was just sort of the topic. And at the meeting, I believe Senator Gaida said, "Oh, I'm on a committee that looks at that issue." And then, but nothing happened. Like, no, we didn't vote. You didn't vote on whether to kill the topic or to accept the topic. It was it was just still there. So we kept it on the books for you to
Okay.
decide.
Anybody? Representative Weber?
I think I raised it at the request of a former representative now that my memory's being jogged. And as I have heard nothing further in this direction, it may be one that we want to leave for a little while to see if anybody comes up with something. But if not, I'm comfortable going either way with it.
Okay. What about the Secretary of State's Archives and Records?
Yeah, that one is, we do have a limitation that we cannot, from a performance audit perspective, go into a constitutional officer like the Secretary of State's office in his duties. So I think that was the reason that we tabled that, or
You
at
can't
this point in
audit
time.
that office?
Correct.
Yes.
There's, in our statute, it says that we're not allowed to audit I think the constitutional duties of a constitutional officer. And so you've got, I believe, the Attorney General, the Treasurer, and who else?
Secretary of
State,
State.
right. Those are 3 constitutional officers, and we're unclear if we can audit anything they do, if everything in their agency is considered a constitutional duty, which isn't written out, and no one's defined what constitutional duties are. At least we haven't found it, and we had Senate Research do some work for us, and it's a little vague. So, and why we can't look at those offices is another one of these questions of, it goes way back to the beginning of this committee back in like 87. It seems like it was a holdover from, there was a sunset review commission that was in place before they created performance audits. And there were certain agencies that the sunset review committee couldn't look at, including corrections and the constitutional officers. So I think it was a holdover from that, but you know,
Weird.
why we can't now, I'm not sure.
Representative Weber.
Well, if we can't now because of statute, and I think you probably provided us with a statutory reference, but perhaps you could do that again, because it seems to me that there's a difference between what we are prohibited to do by statute, because we could simply change the statute should we choose to audit those branches of government. If there is a constitutional prohibition, that is something we can't stray into. But it sounds, from what you're saying, that it's more of a statutory prohibition than a constitutional one. And I think, from my perspective, unless there is a constitutional separation of powers issue, which doesn't seem to me like there can be, because what we do is audit the executive branch all the time, and we're the legislature, and we've always been told that the Secretary of State's office sort of occupies a unique niche between those two. It would seem to me that one of the things we could consider is legislative action on the statute, because it does seem to me that the constitutional offices have an enormous amount of effect on our government and our citizens, and if nobody's kind of overseeing that, it's perhaps an issue. Also, the number of different things those agencies are doing at this point in time is enormous. So I think that's something for the committee to think about and for members to discuss among themselves. But I also want to say that I'm really very pleased at the thoughtfulness and quality of the debate that we've had here today, because we've spent a number of years coming in and saying, yeah, we'll do that, bang, and leaving. And I think these are things we really ought to think a little bit harder about. So thank you for bringing that up.
We didn't know we could do that.
Yeah,
It was chaired by Senator Reagan.
We oh, got it. Okay. We budget archives and records. And I mean, line items in the budget, we know, it's not like the judicial branch where we just give them money and say, here, go spend it. So,
Yeah, if I may, it's RSA 14:31A, letter D, where it states, this is the LBA Audit Division statute. Letter D is conduct such program result audits of any department, board, institution, etc. However, further in the middle of the section, it says, this paragraph shall not apply to constitutional officers in the execution of their constitutional duties. So that's the limitation that we're referring to.
There may be one, the only reason I can think of is we don't audit the legislature, right? Because that would be a conflict. You're our boss. And so we audit everyone else. I believe the legislature has a role in picking those positions, and whether that's in some way considered, you know, you're picking that person and it's the legislative role, and then should we go in there and audit them? That may be the reason, but that's just a guess on my part.
so if we were hearing, for example, that all the papers in the archives had water dripping on them and they were getting mildewed, we couldn't audit how the Secretary of State was handling the records of the state?
I think it's questionable. I mean, we'd have to seek legal advice on whether you could send us in. Now, could you hire an outside consultant to come in and do that? Probably, which is kind of strange. But whether you could send us in to look at that is questionable.
Okay,
Madam Chair?
yes,
Thank-
Senator Whitley.
Thank you. I will volunteer for the committee to, work with Senate Research to see if we can get more legislative history on the provision that they just mentioned.
That would be great. That would be helpful. Great. Put the lawyers on it.
The last topic there,
Is OBLC.
OPLC, just a little history on that. There was a lot of discussion amongst previous committees. Obviously, there's been a lot of restructuring going on with OPLC, a lot of transition and turnover in positions and things of that nature. But the LBA also made them aware that there has been several recent audits that have touched on elements of OPLC. In particular, the most recent Board of Dental Examiners, there was a very large section there that dealt with OPLC's control structure and environment. And there will be some elements as well coming out in the mental health workforce requirements audit, because you're dealing with several boards there too. So given the work that we were doing, the committee decided just to table a full-blown audit of OPLC itself. So that's a little history with that one. So.
Okay, so does anybody wish to take any of these tabled audits off the table? Not hearing anything. Yeah, exactly. Representative Weber.
With respect to the Office of Professional Licensure, that's absolutely true that there have been little bits of it looked at. Having sat on this committee continuously the longest, it seems to me that every year we say we ought to do something about that, and they're still restructuring. And they have been restructured continuously for as long as I have served in this body. So at some point, we might want to think about a look at the current structure and seeing, because many of the things that are recommended during an audit are actually very helpful to an agency and their operations. And it's a fresh pair of eyes, a different perspective, and sometimes quite useful, either for the agency or for us or for both, depending on everybody's mindset going in and coming out. So I definitely don't want to take this one off the list, but I certainly agree that this isn't the time to launch into something else. And we may decide to do it within the scope of those bites of particular professions that we have done.
Thank you. Yes, Senator Lang.
So thank you. I agree. It shouldn't come off. I mean, I know the House passed a 78-page about the restructuring of
Yep.
OPLC, and I know I put a couple bills in about OPLC. So
We've changed
I-
the funding.
we changed the funding sources and a bunch of things. So I agree. While it might need something, we first have to get it into a stable place before we can audit anything.
Is there any other business that any members want to bring forward? Okay. Well, I don't see.
This is a public
It,
meeting. It is not a public hearing, so
Right.
it would be up to the folks here.
for 2 minutes. 2 minutes, Mr. Haas. Okay, 1.5 minutes. Because I have a meeting at 10:45. 2 minutes.
Just want to give you a history. I have two comments I want to make on the Commission of Human Rights and the Office of Professional.
Yep.
Joe
And
Haas
tell
from
us.
Gilmanton. Just 1.5 minutes here.
Okay.
On the Commission of Human Rights and also the Office of Professional Licensure and Certification, my comment is that I did attend the House Bill, I don't know the number, on human rights at the House Judiciary Committee, and Ani, AHNI, the black woman in charge of the human rights, came in and she gave an excellent presentation saying that there's 230 cases there sitting, and they have 5 investigators, 4 that actually have a caseload of 25 each. The other one handles the backload. And she asked for 3 more investigators, and she got 2, according to the budget, the last I heard. And also, too, the number of hearings they have per year is less than 1. There's 4 hearings in 5 years' time. And so I make a comparison to the Office of Professional. There's a subdivision of that, that's the Real Estate Commission. So I would like, if you could, to reopen, to have another vote, maybe, to have an investigation of that, because I've asked. Lindsay Courtney is the chair, is the commissioner. She sent me an email the other day because I got the royal runaround from the underlings. And the underlings, all they say is contact the right to know if you have a problem. So I contacted Thomas Kerr, K-E-H-R, at the State House Annex. That's where I'm going next. And I'm trying to get a comparison, like what I just told you on the human rights. How many cases do they have of complaints at the Real Estate Commission? I can't get an answer of that. I mean, right to know, I can go and like get a whole year's supply and do my own statistics. But I'm trying to find out how long a time does it take to have a complaint process there? I filed one last June. It's still sitting there. 10 months has gone by. Ridiculous. How many investigators they have? They have 1 investigator. They have 1 paralegal. That's it. I don't know what the other details, but it would be nice to have you all investigate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the date of the next meeting, you guys will tell us, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Officially, it's at your call.
Yes, but I'm not going to set a meeting until I hear
Yeah,
from
we will reach out
Mr.
to you,
Smith.
Madam Chair, when we need another meeting, but certainly if the committee wants to
Right,
conduct, that's right.
yeah. So, thank you all very much. There being no further business, we'll adjourn.